The first thing people in Calder's Bend told you about Eli Voss was not what he had done. It was what he looked like when he walked through town. He came in maybe once a week, always on a Thursday, always before the rest of the town was properly awake. He rode a gray horse that moved without hurry, and he himself moved the same way, as though the world operated on a schedule he had privately decided not to follow. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been used hard for a long time and had simply stopped caring about the evidence. His face was the kind that people described differently depending on how they felt about him. Those who feared him said it was cold. Those who had never spoken to him said it was unreadable. The handful of people who had done business with him said only that he was direct, which in Calder's Bend in the year 1883 could mean almost anything depending on who was saying it. He did not tip his hat. He did not make conversation at the counter of the general store or lean against the post outside the barber shop the way the other ranchers did on a slow morning. He bought what he needed, paid what was asked without negotiating, and rode back out the way he had come. The whole transaction never took more than 20 minutes, and yet somehow his presence sat in the town for the rest of the day like weather that had passed, but left the air changed behind it. His ranch was 4 miles north of town, up a long switchback road that most people in Calder's Bend had never had occasion to travel. It sat at the base of a sandstone ridge, a substantial spread by any measure, with good grass and a reliable creek and a barn that had been built to last. He ran cattle, a few hundred head, managed largely on his own with 2 hired hands who came and went, and never talked much about what it was like to work for a man like Eli Voss. The ranch had a name, the Voss Land, which was not imaginative, but it was accurate, and Eli Voss, as far as anyone could tell, had very little interest in things that were not accurate. The stories about him had started, as stories in small towns always start, with something that was mostly true and had been improved upon in the retelling. 3 years prior, a man named Carver had come to the ranch drunk and looking for trouble over a water rights dispute that had already been settled legally in Eli's favor. Carver had arrived with 2 friends and a great deal of loud intention. What happened next depended entirely on who you asked. The version most people believed was that Eli Voss had walked out onto his porch alone, said something nobody else could hear, and the 3 men had ridden away without a word. Carver had left Calder's Bend the following month. His 2 friends never spoke of it. Nobody asked Eli what had been said. Nobody particularly wanted to know, so the town had built its understanding of him from the outside, the way you understand a house you have never entered, by the shape of it, by what the windows showed and what they did not, by whether the light inside ever changed. And the picture they had built was of a man who had chosen solitude the way other men chose a profession, deliberately, completely, and without apparent regret. What nobody in Calder's Bend knew, because he had never told anyone and would not have known how to begin, was that Eli Voss was lonely in the particular and quiet way of someone who has been alone so long that the loneliness has become indistinguishable from ordinary life. It sat inside him like a stone in still water, present, permanent, something he had long since stopped reaching in to move. He was 38 years old. He had not had a real conversation in longer than he could honestly say. Clara Whitmore arrived in Calder's Bend on a Wednesday in early September, which was already unusual because the stage only came through on Mondays and Fridays, and nobody arrived in Calder's Bend on a Wednesday unless they had ridden themselves, which Clara had. She came in on a brown mare with a bedroll tied behind the saddle and a canvas bag across her lap, and the expression of someone who had been traveling for several days and had made a private agreement with herself not to complain about it. She was 32. Which she would tell you directly if you asked, and sometimes before you asked, because she had noticed that people made assumptions about women traveling alone, and she found it more efficient to simply remove the uncertainty. She was not conventionally striking, but she had a face that people remembered, precise and clear-eyed, with the kind of steadiness in it that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from long practice in not being moved by it. She had come from Colorado. She had been a schoolteacher there for 6 years, in a small mining town called Red Fork that had grown fast on silver money and collapsed just as fast when the silver ran out. The school had closed in March. The boarding house where she lived had closed in April. By May, she had understood that Red Fork was a town in the process of becoming a memory, and that if she intended to have a future, she would need to go looking for it somewhere else. A cousin in New Mexico had written her about Calder's Bend. Good people, he had said, growing steady. Talk of a new schoolhouse come spring. Clara had folded the letter into her coat pocket and thought about it for 2 weeks, and then packed everything she owned into a canvas bag and started riding. She had not come looking for a man. She had not come looking for adventure. She had come looking for a room, a position, and a place where she might be of some use to somebody, which was, she had found, the most honest way to describe what she wanted out of a life. The first person she spoke to in Calder's Bend was Ruth Engel, who ran the dry goods store and had the talent common among people who have lived in small towns their whole lives of reading a new arrival's situation with remarkable speed and accuracy. Ruth looked at the canvas bag, the road-worn coat, the mare that needed water, and the eyes that were tired but not beaten, and she said, "You looking to stay or passing through?" "Staying," Clara said, "if there's work." Ruth Engel considered that. "There's talk of a schoolhouse," she said. "I heard," Clara said. "I'm a teacher." Something shifted in Ruth's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for a piece to arrive that would make the puzzle make sense. "Well," she said, "come in out of the heat." Clara was given a room at the back of the Engel house, temporary but clean, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made it feel less temporary than it was. She spent her first week in Calder's Bend doing what she did in every new place, learning it from the inside out. She walked every street. She visited the church and the post office and the small lending library that the Reverend's wife kept in 2 shelves at the back of the parsonage. She learned names and attached them to faces and watched how people moved through their days, what they worried about, what they were proud of, what they avoided saying directly. It was during this first week that she heard about Eli Voss. She heard it the way you hear most things in a small town, not in one telling but in pieces, dropped casually and accumulated over time until the shape of the thing became clear. Ruth mentioned him in the context of a water dispute that had divided the town 3 years prior. The Reverend mentioned him obliquely in a sermon about the nature of pride, which Clara thought was pointed though she could not be certain. 2 women at the well on a Tuesday morning spoke about him the way people speak about weather, as something present and powerful and not entirely predictable. The picture that assembled itself in Clara's mind over those first days was of a man who had become, through some combination of his own choices and other people's fear, something closer to a fixture of the landscape than a member of the community. He was there, north of town, 4 miles up the switchback road, and he was spoken of, and he was avoided, and the town had arranged itself around his presence the way a river arranges itself around a rock, flowing past, working around, never quite acknowledging that it had been shaped by what it was avoiding. Clara had met men like that before, or thought she had. She found herself curious in the particular way she was always curious about things that didn't add up. The first time she saw him was on a Thursday morning, her second week in Calder's Bend. She was standing outside the general store with a short list in her hand when he rode in on the gray horse. She watched him the way she watched everything, with attention but without obvious scrutiny, because obvious scrutiny had a way of making people behave differently than they otherwise would. He was, she thought, exactly what the stories had described in terms of presence. There was a quality to his stillness that was unusual. Most people in motion carried a certain restlessness even when they were being deliberate, a fidget in the hands, a searching in the eyes. Eli Voss moved through the street as though he had already made every decision that needed making, and the rest was simply execution. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone particularly. He tied the horse at the post, went into the general store, came out 12 minutes later with a wrapped parcel under one arm, untied the horse, mounted, and rode back north without a word to anyone. Clara watched him go. She stood there for a moment with her list in her hand and the sun warm on her shoulders and thought about what it would take to make a man become that self-contained. Whether it was a choice or a wound or simply the accumulated weight of years spent doing everything alone. She thought about it more than she probably should have for someone who had only just arrived in a town and had more pressing things to concern herself with. The schoolhouse question resolved itself in October. The town council, which consisted of 5 men who agreed on almost nothing, managed to agree that a schoolhouse was needed and that Clara Whitmore was the person to run it. The building itself would not be finished until spring, but classes could begin in the church hall in the meanwhile, and Clara threw herself into the work with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting for something useful to do. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She had the particular gift of making children feel that what they were learning mattered, not in the abstract, future will thank you way that most schoolteachers offered, but in the immediate and personal way, as though each piece of knowledge were a tool she was handing them directly, one they could use before they even left the room. The parents noticed. Ruth Engel told her the town was grateful. The Reverend said something kind on Sunday. Clara accepted all of it without false modesty and without particular pride, because teaching was simply what she did and what she was, and praise for being yourself had always seemed to her slightly beside the point. It was a student who first connected the two things in her mind, an 8-year-old boy named Thomas Aldred, who had the quick eyes and loose tongue common to youngest children, and who mentioned one afternoon, in the middle of a reading lesson, that his father had done some fence work for the man up on the ridge, and that the man had a whole room full of books that nobody ever read. Clara kept her face very still. "A whole room full of books," she said. Thomas nodded with the authority of someone reporting a great discovery. "Hundreds of them. His father had seen through the window. The man lived alone and didn't talk to nobody," Thomas added, and then corrected himself because Clara had a way of waiting silently after grammatical errors that made you want to fix them yourself, and said, anyone, Thomas agreed, "except maybe the horses." Clara returned to the lesson, but the image stayed with her, a room full of books in a house 4 miles up a switchback road, unread, or perhaps read and reread until the spines were soft, which was a different kind of loneliness altogether. She thought about Eli Voss that evening for longer than she had allowed herself to think about him before. She sat at the small desk in her room at the Engel house, with her lesson papers in front of her, and the lamplight yellow and steady, and she considered what she actually knew about him, not what the town said, but what she had observed directly. A man who moved with deliberateness, a man who paid what was asked without arguing, a man who, according to Thomas Aldred's second-hand account, had a room full of books in a house where nobody visited and nobody was invited. That was not a dangerous man. That was a private one. The town had confused the two, which was a common enough mistake and an understandable one, but a mistake nonetheless. She made a decision that night. It arrived quietly, the way her decisions usually did, not as a dramatic resolution, but as a simple acknowledgement of what she was already going to do. She would ride up to the Voss ranch and introduce herself. She was a new schoolteacher. She had a reason. The county needed a survey of which children in the district were not attending school. She had written to the county office about it herself the previous week, which meant the reason was not even invented, which pleased her sense of accuracy. She did not tell Ruth Engel where she was going, not because she was being secretive, but because she had learned that mentioning Eli Voss's name in this town had a way of generating advice she hadn't asked for. and she found other people's fear contagious in ways she preferred to avoid when she could. She rode up the switchback road on a Saturday morning in late October, when the sky was the particular high blue that only came in autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of old gold. The road was longer than 4 miles felt in town. It climbed steadily, winding through pale grass and scattered juniper, and the view behind her widened as she rose until she could see Calder's Bend small and ordered in the valley below, its rooftops catching the morning sun. The ranch appeared gradually. First the barn, then the fence lines, then the house itself, a solid 2-story structure built from stone and timber, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a yard that was functional rather than decorative. Everything in its place and built to last rather than to impress. It looked, she thought, like the home of a man who had strong opinions about what things were for. There was no one visible as she rode in. She tied her horse at the post by the gate and stood for a moment, composing herself not against fear, because she did not feel afraid, but against the slight self-consciousness of arriving unannounced at a place where arrivals were clearly not expected. She walked to the front door and knocked. There was a long pause, long enough that she began to form a plan for what she would do if no one answered, which would involve leaving a note in her best handwriting and riding back down with her dignity intact. She was just deciding on the precise wording of the note when the door opened. Eli Voss was taller than he seemed on horseback, which was already tall. He filled the doorway in the way of a man who had never given much thought to how he filled spaces, because spaces had always arranged themselves around him rather than the other way around. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, which meant he had been doing something before she knocked and had not bothered to change, which she found, for reasons she didn't immediately examine, reassuring. His face was what the town had described, difficult to read, set, weathered, but his eyes, which were a particular shade of gray-green that she had not expected, were not the eyes of a man who felt nothing. They were the eyes of a man who felt a great deal and had become extremely skilled at not showing it. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not rudely, simply with the same careful attention she had noticed from a distance in the street, as though he were doing the same thing she did, reading the situation before committing to a response. "Mr. Voss," she said, "my name is Clara Whitmore. I'm the new school teacher in Calder's Bend. I'm conducting a survey of school-age children in the district." She paused. "I wondered if you had a moment." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and unhurried, each word placed deliberately, as though speech itself were something to be done properly or not at all. She stepped inside. The front room was spare and orderly, a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with a low fire in it. On the far wall, a doorway that she suspected led to the room Thomas Aldred's father had seen through the window. She could see, even from where she stood, the edge of a bookshelf. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to make a decision and sat across from her, his large hands resting on his knees with the stillness she had noticed before. "I don't have children," he said. It was not impatient, it was simply direct. "I know," she said, "but the survey covers all households in the district. I'm trying to understand the full population." She produced a small notebook from her coat pocket and opened it to a fresh page, because having something to do with her hands made this easier. "How long have you been on this land, Mr. Voss?" He considered that. 14 years, he said. "Did you build the house yourself?" A pause. It seemed to surprise him that she was asking. "Most of it," he said. "Stonework I did alone, timber I had help with." Clara wrote that down, not because it was relevant to the survey, but because writing gave her a reason to look at the page instead of at him, which she sensed might make him more willing to keep talking. "It's well built," she said. "You can tell from the road." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You rode up from town?" "Yes. Most people don't come up this road." She looked up from the notebook. "I know," she said simply. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite an opening, but the place just before one, the slight softening around the eyes of a man who has been braced for something that did not arrive. He looked at her with what she could only describe as a measuring quality, not hostile, not unfriendly, but genuine and careful in the way she suspected most things about him were genuine and careful. "You want coffee," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He made it the way a man makes coffee who has been making it alone for a long time, efficiently, without asking preferences, which she found she did not mind because the coffee itself was good, strong and hot, and poured without ceremony into a cup that was plain and clean. She wrapped her hands around it and looked at the room around her while he settled back into his chair. She asked him straightforward questions. How many acres? Whether the water rights covered the full creek length, whether the road up had always been in that condition, or if the recent rains had made it worse. He answered all of it in the same measured way, complete sentences. No more information than requested, but no less either. Not evasive, simply economical. Then she said, "I heard you have a room full of books." He looked at her. It was the first time she had seen him look genuinely caught off guard. A slight adjustment in his expression, like a man who has stepped onto ice and found it firmer than he expected. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. "From a student whose father did fence work for you." She kept her voice neutral. "He mentioned it during a reading lesson." Eli Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and she thought she had said something wrong, but he walked to the doorway she had noticed earlier and pushed it fully open. "Come look," he said. She stood and crossed the room and stood in the doorway of what had been a dining room at some point, and was now, entirely and without apology, a library. 3 walls of shelves, floor to ceiling, built from the same timber as the house, filled with books of every age and size. History, natural science, surveying manuals, a complete Shakespeare, several volumes of philosophy, a row of what appeared to be agricultural journals with careful annotations on the spines in small handwriting. More books than most households in this territory would accumulate in 3 generations. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I've been collecting them since I was 20, he said from somewhere behind her. His voice was quieter than it had been, less measured, as though the room made him speak differently. Nobody here much cared for that. She turned to look at him. He was standing just inside the main room, not quite in the library, as though he had brought her to the door but wasn't sure about following her inside, as though showing it to someone was already more than he was accustomed to. "How many have you read?" she asked. "All of them," he said. She believed him. She looked at the shelves again, at the careful order of them, the well-worn spines, the small notations she could see on some of the pages visible through open covers. "Which one are you reading now?" she asked. He crossed the room to the shelves and ran his hand along a row until he found a slim volume and held it toward her. Thoreau. The spine was soft with handling. She took it from him and opened it to the marked page, and read the passage his bookmark had been resting in, read it carefully, and then looked up at him. "This is about solitude," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you find it comforting?" she asked. "Or do you read it the way some people read about things they're trying to understand?" The question hung in the air of the library room, between the rows of books and the late morning light coming through the single window, and Eli Voss looked at her for a long time before he answered. "Both," he said, "depending on the day." It was the most honest thing anyone in Calder's Bend had said to her since she arrived. She handed the book back to him carefully. "I should finish my survey," she said, not because she wanted to leave, but because she had already stayed longer than a survey required, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that. He walked her to the door. At the threshold, she paused with her coat buttoned against the October air and turned to face him. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, "and for showing me the library." He nodded once. Then he said, "You can borrow one, if you'd like. I don't lend them to most people, but I think you'd return it in the same condition you took it." She considered that. "What makes you think so?" He looked at her with that gray-green steadiness. "The way you held the Thoreau," he said, "like it was worth handling carefully. Clara Whitmore looked at Eli Voss, this silent and careful and entirely misunderstood man standing in the doorway of a house full of books that nobody had ever been invited to see, and she felt something she had not expected to feel when she rode up a switchback road to conduct a survey on a Saturday morning in October. "I'll bring it back next week," she said. "If that's all right." He considered for only a moment. "That's all right," he said. She rode back down to Calder's Bend with a copy of Walden in her canvas bag, and the particular feeling of having discovered something that had been there a long time, waiting to be found by someone who would know what it was. She brought the book back the following Saturday. She had read it in 4 evenings, carefully, with a pencil in hand, and she had marked 2 passages lightly in the margins, not permanently, just faint check marks beside lines that she thought were exactly right, because she was the kind of reader who had conversations with books rather than simply receiving them. When she handed it back to Eli at the door, she said, "I made 2 marks, both in pencil. I can erase them if you prefer." He opened the book to the first mark without hesitation and read the passage she had noted. He was quiet for a moment, then he looked up. "Why this one?" he asked. "Because it's about the difference between being alone by choice and being alone by circumstance," she said, "and I thought it was worth distinguishing." He looked at her, then at the book. "Come in," he said. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. What it was, in the most accurate description, was a conversation that started that second Saturday and did not finish. A conversation about books first, and then gradually about everything else, the way real conversations are, which begin with the surface of things, and slowly, through no conscious decision, find their way to what lies below. She discovered a man of particular and unusual intelligence who had simply had no one to talk to about it for a very long time. The books had been his conversation, his argument, his companionship, in the absence of any other. He had opinions about what he read, strong ones, expressed carefully but without apology, once he understood that she would engage with them rather than simply accept them. She pushed back when she disagreed, which surprised him the first time, and thereafter seemed to please him in the specific way that opposition pleases a person who has been surrounded by agreement for too long. On the third Saturday, he said something about the nature of solitude that she thought was not quite right, and she said so directly, and they argued about it for 20 minutes while the fire burned low and the afternoon light moved across the floor of the library room, and neither of them won, which was, she would think later, the point. She asked him about the ranch. He told her in the way she had learned. He told everything he cared about, carefully, with detail, in the language of someone who understood what he was describing from the inside. The south pasture that held water after rain, the particular behavior of the cattle in early spring, the way the ridge behind the house looked at first light, the sandstone going from gray to amber as the sun found it. He did not ask about Colorado for several weeks, and when he did, it was not with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation, but with the direct interest of someone who had decided the information mattered, and was willing to wait until he understood it properly. She told him about Red Fork, about the school closing, about packing everything she owned into a canvas bag and riding toward a cousin's description of a place she had never seen. "You weren't afraid?" he asked. "I was practical," she said. "Sometimes they look the same." He turned that over for a moment the way she had noticed he turned things over, slowly, with real consideration. "I think I've confused them," he said at last, "more than once." It was the most personal thing he had said to her yet. She let it sit where he had placed it without pressing on it, because she had learned by then that Eli Voss needed room around his admissions the way some plants needed room around their roots, not crowding, just space to hold their shape. "So have I," she said simply. The town, meanwhile, had opinions. Ruth Engel said nothing directly, which meant she was watching carefully. The Reverend's wife mentioned, in the context of an entirely unrelated conversation, that some people in Calder's Bend had concerns about Miss Whitmore's whereabouts on Saturday mornings. Two of the fathers on the school council asked Clara, with varying degrees of directness, whether she thought it was wise to visit a man with Eli Voss's reputation. Clara considered her answers carefully each time, which was to say she gave them honest ones without apology. She said that she had found no evidence of anything alarming in her visits to the Voss ranch. She said that Eli Voss was a well-read and courteous man who kept an orderly home and had been nothing but respectful in her presence. She said that in her experience, a reputation built on the absence of information was a fragile foundation for anything, including fear. People looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism. She understood this. She was asking them to revise a story they had been telling themselves for 3 years, and stories, once settled, resisted revision. She did not expect immediate success. She simply said what was true and let it stand there until people decided what to do with it. What she did not say, because she had not decided yet what to do with it herself, was what she felt on the ride down from the Voss ranch each Saturday afternoon. A particular fullness that was different from the satisfaction of a good day's work or the comfort of an interesting book. Something more personal than that and less easily categorized. A sense of having been in the presence of a person who saw her clearly, not the school teacher or the practical woman who had ridden into town on a brown mare with a canvas bag, but the person underneath all of that, the one who made pencil marks in margins and argued about solitude and had been quietly lonely in her own way for longer than she generally admitted. She had not expected that. She had not come looking for it. But she was honest enough, when she sat with it in the evenings in her east-facing room at the Engel house, to acknowledge what it was. The incident happened on a Tuesday in early December, when it was not expected and no one was prepared for it. A man named Pruett, who was passing through Calder's Bend on his way to somewhere else and had spent the previous evening in the saloon accumulating grievances, rode up the switchback road in the late afternoon with the evident intention of settling an old score that had nothing, as far as anyone could determine, to do with Eli Voss specifically, and everything to do with the kind of man who goes looking for a version of himself to fight. Clara heard about it from Ruth Engel, who heard it from the station master, who had been watching from the edge of town. Pruitt had arrived at the ranch gate. Eli had come out onto the porch. There had been words, though nobody heard them. Then there had been silence for a long moment, and then Pruitt had turned his horse around and ridden back down, and he was gone from Calder's Bend before supper. This time, unlike with Carver 3 years prior, there was a witness. The station master's nephew had been on the ridge doing fence work and had a clear view of the yard. He told people what he had seen. Eli Voss had stood on his porch with his arms at his sides and spoken quietly and without moving, and what he had said, near as the nephew could tell from the lip movement and the small gestures, was that whatever business Pruitt thought he had, he was mistaken about the address, and that if he had a grievance worth having, he was welcome to state it in town, in daylight, in front of the people it concerned, or not at all. And then he had waited, and Pruitt had looked at him for a long moment and ridden away. The town chewed on this for several days. Ruth Engel said that didn't sound like a dangerous man to her. The Reverend said something in Sunday's sermon about the difference between the appearance of strength and strength itself. Two of the school council fathers mentioned to Clara, with the slight embarrassment of men revising previous statements, that they supposed Voss wasn't the sort of trouble they had thought. Clara said nothing except that she was glad no one had been hurt. She had not yet told anyone about the library. She had not yet told anyone about the conversations that had, by December, stretched from Saturday mornings into Saturday afternoons, sometimes past the point where she needed to ride back quickly to arrive before dark. She had not told anyone that she looked forward to Saturdays the way she had not looked forward to a day since she was a child. She had not told anyone, and she had barely admitted it to herself, that the thing she felt on those rides down from the ridge was something she recognized from books she had read, something she had read about carefully and analytically. and had never quite expected to feel in the direct, inconvenient, entirely real way she was now feeling it. It was a Saturday in mid-December when it changed, though changed was perhaps not the right word for something that had been moving toward this point since October, like a river moving toward its eventual joining with the sea. They were in the library room, as they usually were, though by this visit Clara felt as comfortable in it as she felt in her own small room at the Engel house, perhaps more so because the books were better. They were disagreeing about something in a volume of natural philosophy that she had brought from the lending library, and he had borrowed from her, which reversed the usual arrangement and made them both quietly pleased with themselves. The fire was good, the afternoon light was failing early the way it did in December, and outside the window the first snow of the year had begun to fall in thin, silent lines. Clara looked up from her book and saw the snow and felt something settle in her, quiet and certain. She did not say anything for a moment. She simply looked at it. "You're not in a hurry to leave," Eli said. It was not a question. He was watching her watch the snow. In that way he watched things, with the full, steady attention that she had come to understand, was simply how he was present in the world. "No," she said. She turned to look at him. He was sitting in the chair across from her with the book open in his hands but not looking at it, looking at her, and the expression on his face was the most open she had seen it since the first day she had stood in the doorway of this room, and he had waited to see what she would say about the books. "I'm glad you came up that first day," he said. It arrived simply, without ceremony, the way everything he said arrived. "I didn't expect it. I'm not sure I'd have known to want it if I had, but I'm glad." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she set her book down on the arm of the chair and said, "So am I." They looked at each other for a moment in the library room, with the snow falling outside and the fire low and steady, and what passed between them was not the dramatic clarity of a realization, but the quieter recognition of something that had been true for some time, and was now simply being allowed to exist plainly. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking about what this place would be like," he said slowly, "if it had more than one person in it." He looked at the shelves briefly, then back at her. "Not a hand, not a neighbor, someone who would argue with me about books." He paused. "Someone I'd be glad to see every morning." Clara Whitmore looked at this man, quiet and careful and entirely himself, who had spent 14 years on a ridge outside a town that had turned him into a story without ever asking him a question, and who had opened his door to her on an October morning not because he had to, but because something in him had decided, in that single careful moment, that she was worth trusting. "That is," she said, "a very practical proposal." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I can do it differently," he said, "if you'd prefer." "No," she said, "I prefer it exactly as it is." The snow fell outside the window, steady and silent, covering the yard and the fences and the road that led down to Calder's Bend, and somewhere below, the town went about its Saturday evening without knowing that the story it had been telling about the man on the ridge was in the process of becoming a different story entirely. They were married in February, when the snow was still on the ground and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and pale, in the small church in Calder's Bend, with Ruth Engel in the front row looking satisfied with herself in a way that suggested she had seen this coming long before either of the two people involved had admitted it to themselves, and the Reverend, who had revised his opinion of Eli Voss 3 times in the previous 4 months and felt privately that his final revision was his best work, presiding with genuine warmth. The school council fathers were there. Thomas Aldred was there, seated in the 3rd pew, with the particular pride of a child who believes, not entirely incorrectly, that his mention of a room full of books had been in some obscure way responsible for all of this. Eli wore a clean coat and stood at the front of the church with the same stillness he brought to everything, but with something new underneath it, visible to Clara because she had learned to read him the way she read everything she cared about, carefully and from the inside. What she saw was a man who had lived 14 years in the measured expectation that he was essentially alone and had arrived with some bewilderment and a great deal of quiet gratitude at the discovery that he was not. She walked toward him down the aisle of the small church in her best dress, which was practical and well-made rather than elaborate, because she was practical and well-made rather than elaborate, and that had always seemed to her the best thing to be. When she reached him, he took her hand, and the way he held it, careful and certain both at once, said everything the ceremony was about to say in much less time. The Reverend spoke. They answered in clear, even voices, both of them, because they were both people who meant what they said and said what they meant, which was, Clara thought, the only real foundation for anything. In the spring, the schoolhouse was finished. Clara stood in the middle of it on a Monday morning, with 23 children in their seats, and the smell of new timber in the air and sunlight coming through windows that were properly sized and properly set, and she thought about Red Fork, about the school closing, about the canvas bag and the long ride and the room at the Engel house, and a switchback road she had decided to ride on a Saturday morning when most people would not have. She thought about knocked doors and what lives could be on the other side of them. She began the lesson. That evening she rode home up the switchback road in the long spring light, and when the ranch came into view she saw Eli at the fence line, doing what he was always doing, the steady necessary work of a man who understood his land and his responsibilities to it. He saw her coming and straightened and watched her ride in with the same attention he had watched everything from the first day, but with something added now, something that had been there since February and grew rather than diminished, which she had found was the true measure of a thing. She dismounted and led her horse into the yard, and he met her at the gate. "How was the first day?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Real." He took the horse's reins from her and led the animal toward the barn, and she walked beside him in the long evening light of the South Range, and somewhere behind them the creek caught the last of the sun, and the ridge on the eastern boundary stood clear against the sky. The town of Calder's Bend had feared the lonely cowboy on the ridge for 3 years. It had built a story around his silence and his stillness and his gray horse and his deliberate way of moving through the world, and the story had served the town's need for something to be cautious of, which was a need towns often had. What the story had not accounted for was a school teacher from Colorado with a canvas bag and a pencil in her hand, and the particular kind of courage that looks like practicality from the outside, who had looked at a man the town called dangerous and seen instead what he actually was, a person careful and private and entirely worth knowing, waiting in a house full of books for someone willing to knock. She had knocked. He had opened the door, and everything else, as Clara would say, years later to her students when they asked about how people found their way toward the things that mattered, had simply followed from that. If this story found you somewhere quiet, I'd like to know where. A name, a town, a time of day. Leave it below. And tell me honestly, what did this story do right, and what could it do better? Every answer helps the next story become what it should be.